Tonight, we're stepping inside that hidden world to explore what it was really like to be a Victorian brothel worker, the daily routines, the dangers, the rules, and the surprising realities that shaped these women's lives beyond the myths and moral judgments of the era. This isn't a story told for shock, it's a human story, full of struggle, survival, and voices history often tried to silence. By the end of this video, you may see Victorian society on the women who lived on its margins very differently. If you enjoy calm, deeply researched history that uncovers the uncomfortable truths of the past, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. I'd love to know what part of history you want us to explore next. And don't forget to check out our other videos for more quiet, immersive journeys into the past. Now, let's step through the door and uncover a life few were meant to see. Imagine walking through a gaslit Victorian street, the air thick with coal smoke, carriage wheels rattling past, and behind an unmarked door, a world most history books barely whisper about. If you want to understand why brothel work existed in Victorian Britain, you have to start with the city itself, not the postcard version, not the polished paintings of Parliament and promenades. You have to imagine the city as it actually felt to live in: loud, crowded, smoky, and always slightly on edge. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain's cities were growing faster than anyone had planned for. London was no longer just a capital. It was a magnet. Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, each one pulling people in from farms, villages, and small towns. People arrived with a bag, a name, and the hope that the city would somehow be kinder than the land they left behind. Often, it wasn't. Entire neighborhoods appeared almost overnight. Rows of narrow houses packed together. Streets where sunlight barely reached the ground. Rooms rented not by the apartment, but by the corner. It was possible to live in a city of millions and still feel completely invisible. The gap between rich and poor wasn't subtle. You could walk from a street of polished windows and carriage wheels to a street of broken boots and open drains in less than 5 minutes. Victorian cities didn't hide poverty. They stacked it neatly beside wealth and pretended not to notice. For working-class women, this mattered more than almost anything else. There were jobs, yes, plenty of them, but plenty did not mean livable. Domestic service was the most common option. Long hours, live-in arrangements, one mistaker, broken plate, a raised voice, a room around, you could be dismissed on the spot. No reference, no safety net, just the street. Factory work paid wages that barely covered food, let alone rent. 12-hour shifts for coins that vanished as soon as they were earned. Street selling, sewing, laundering, each one exhausting, each one unreliable. Illness or injury could end your income overnight. And there was one problem that followed women everywhere. Wages were not equal. A man doing unskilled labor could earn enough to scrape by. A woman doing the same could not. This was not an accident. It was policy, custom, and moral belief rolled into one. Women were not expected to survive on their own. And yet, thousands had to. This is where prostitution enters the story, not as scandal, but as arithmetic. When rent is due, when food costs more than yesterday, when there is no family left to ask, when the factory closes or the employer dismisses you without warning, survival stops being philosophical. It becomes practical. Brothel work flourished in Victorian Britain because the cities created perfect conditions for it. Dense populations, large numbers of unmarried men, wages that failed women, and a social system that punished poverty but offered no escape from it. Importantly, prostitution was not hidden. It was regulated, watched, discussed, and quietly accepted. Everyone knew where the brothels were. Cab drivers knew, policemen knew, doctors knew, moral reformers definitely knew. The city did not pretend prostitution didn't exist. It pretended it was someone else's problem, and there were many kinds of brothels. This part often gets lost. Some were large houses in respectable neighborhoods, with carpets, mirrors, and rules about behavior. Others were cramped rooms above taverns or half-collapsed buildings down narrow alleys. The city produced a hierarchy of sex work, just as it produced a hierarchy of everything else. A woman's position depended on where she landed, and where she landed often depended on nothing more than timing, age, and luck. It's important to say this clearly. Most women did not enter brothel work because they wanted excitement. They entered because it paid more than the alternatives, sometimes much more. A single night could earn what a factory job paid in a week. That difference mattered when you were choosing between hunger and endurance. Victorian society understood this, even if it refused to say it out loud. Public speeches praised purity. Sermons warned of moral collapse. Newspapers scolded women for corruption. Meanwhile, the same city depended on their labor to manage what it refused to regulate honestly. Prostitution was framed as a necessary evil, a phrase that did a lot of work without offering much help. Necessary for whom was rarely discussed. The city also offered anonymity. In villages, everyone knew your name. In cities, you could disappear. You could change it, reinvent it, or lose it entirely. For women with no family protection, anonymity was both a risk and a shield. You could be forgotten, but you could also escape the past. This mattered for women who had already broken Victorian rules. Pregnancy outside marriage, rumors, assaults no one believed, dismissal without explanation. The city did not ask many questions. It only asked whether you could pay. Brothel work became one answer to that question, and this is where modern assumptions can mislead us. Victorian cities were not filled with naive girls wandering blindly into danger. They were filled with people making decisions inside narrow corridors of choice. Not free choices, not equal ones, but choices all the same. If you stand on a crowded Victorian street imagined, of course you can almost feel the pressure, the noise of carts, the smell of coal smoke, the push of bodies moving past each other without looking. Somewhere behind a door is warmth, light, and money. Somewhere outside is cold, hunger, and uncertainty. The city does not care which you choose. That is why prostitution grew alongside industry, not because cities were immoral, but because they were efficient. They took labor where it was cheapest. They paid as little as possible, and they left the consequences to individuals. For many women, the brothel was not an escape from the city. It was a product of it. And as we move forward, it's worth holding on to this idea. These women were not separate from Victorian society. They were shaped by it, fed by its failures, managed by its rules, condemned by its language. The city created the trade. The women simply lived inside what the city made. In the next chapter, we'll look at how Victorian society talked about morality loudly, confidently, on how that language often hid a very different set of behaviors behind closed doors. Victorian Britain liked rules. It liked labels. It liked putting people into neat moral boxes and pretending those boxes never leaked. Respectable, fallen, pure, corrupt, good women and bad women, clear lines, simple answers. At least, that was the story it told itself. On the surface, Victorian society was obsessed with respectability. Entire lives were organized around it. What you wore, how you spoke, where you walked, who you were seen with. A woman's reputation, once damaged, was considered almost impossible to repair. Respectability was fragile, like fine china, and everyone acted as if it might shatter at any moment, especially women. Female purity became a kind of social currency. A woman was expected to be modest, quiet, sexually innocent, and morally steady, ideally all at once. This ideal did not change much whether she was rich or poor. The difference was that wealthy women had money to protect them, while poor women had only luck. Men, on the other hand, were held to a different standard. Officially, they were supposed to be moral too. Unofficially, society made room for their desires, a great deal of room. This is where hypocrisy quietly moved in and made itself comfortable. Brothels existed openly in Victorian cities, not advertised in shop windows, but well known. Their locations appeared in police records, health reports, and whispered conversations. Some were even tolerated as long as they stayed in the right neighborhoods. Respectable areas for respectable people, other areas for everything else. The idea was simple: keep moral disorder contained. Men visiting brothels were rarely condemned, in the same way women working there were. A man's visit might be described as weakness, indulgence, or youthful mistake. A woman's presence was treated as proof of moral failure. One act could define her entire life. This double standard was not accidental. It was built into Victorian thinking. Men were believed to have strong physical urges. Women were expected to have none. If a man sought sex, it was natural. If a woman sold it, she was deviant. And yet, society depended on her existence. Prostitution was often described as a necessary evil. That phrase appeared in speeches, pamphlets, and official reports. Necessary, because it supposedly protected respectable women by giving men an outlet. Evil, because admitting that openly would have been uncomfortable. So instead, the burden was placed entirely on women at the bottom. Moral reformers campaigned loudly against prostitution, but their anger often landed on the workers rather than the system. Sermons warned of fallen women leading men astray. Newspapers printed cautionary tales of girls ruined by vice. Rarely did they question why so many women arrived at the same ending. Respectability also came with visibility. To be respectable was to be seen in the right way. Church on Sunday, proper dress, controlled behavior. Brothel workers existed outside that visibility. They were present, but not acknowledged. Known, but not spoken of politely. This created a strange kind of social blindness. A man could pass a brothel on his way to work and pretend it was not there. A neighbor could hear music and laughter at night and look the other way. The city learned how to ignore what it depended on. For women inside the brothel world, this hypocrisy shaped daily life. They were condemned publicly and used privately. Excluded from respectability, but essential to maintaining it. It was a system that asked them to absorb society's contradictions quietly. Even laws reflected this imbalance. When the government worried about disease, it targeted women. The Contagious Diseases Acts allowed police to detain women suspected of prostitution and force medical examinations on them. Men were not examined. Men were not detained. The problem, officially, lived in female bodies. This was presented as public health. In practice, it was moral control. Respectable women were meant to be protected. Working-class women were meant to be managed. What makes this more striking is how rigidly morality was enforced among the poor. Middle and upper-class men could afford privacy. Hotels, private rooms, discretion. Working-class women could not. Their lives unfolded in shared spaces, watched closely by neighbors and employers. A single rumor could follow them for years. Once labeled immoral, opportunities disappeared. Respectable jobs became unavailable. Marriage prospects faded. The label stuck, even if the behavior did not continue. Morality, once lost, was not refundable. And yet, the same society that enforced this standard often pushed women toward the very work it condemned. Low wages, no maternity support, no unemployment protection, no forgiveness for mistakes. Respectability demanded perfection, but offered no tools to survive. It's hard not to notice the contradiction. Victorian society spoke endlessly about virtue, but rarely about mercy. About discipline, but not support. About punishment, but not prevention. This mattered deeply for brothel workers, because respectability was not just about judgment. It was about access. Access to housing, to work, to safety. Without respectability, a woman's world shrank quickly. Some women tried to maintain a double life. Respectable by day, anonymous by night. Different clothes, different names, different streets. It worked for a while. Eventually, most were discovered, or simply exhausted. Others stopped trying altogether. Inside brothels, respectability took on a strange new meaning. Cleanliness, order, rules. Some madams enforced strict behavior to create a sense of propriety within the house. Not because society respected them, but because it reassured clients. Respectability became a performance. And like all performances, it hid effort, strain, and fatigue. The most striking part of Victorian hypocrisy is not that it existed. Hypocrisy exists everywhere. It is how quietly it was accepted, how efficiently it operated, how many people benefited from it without acknowledging its cost. Women bore that cost in lost reputations, limited futures, and constant scrutiny. Men walked between worlds with far fewer consequences. When Victorian society talked about morality, it often meant control. Control of women's bodies, control of working-class lives, control of disorder that threatened the image of progress and refinement. The brothel worker sat at the center of this contradiction. Necessary, condemned, regulated, and erased all at once. Understanding this hypocrisy is essential, because it shaped every interaction a brothel worker had with police, doctors, clients, reformers, and even herself. Respectability was not just something she lacked, it was something used against her. And as we move into the next chapter, we'll see how women actually entered this world, not through moral collapse, but through a series of ordinary losses that Victorian society preferred not to count. Victorian stories liked clear beginnings. A single bad choice, a moment of weakness, one wrong turn down a dark street. It made the ending easier to judge. Real life was rarely that tidy. Most women did not wake up one morning and decide to become brothel workers. There was usually no dramatic turning point. Instead, there was a slow narrowing of options, doors closing one by one. Each loss small enough to survive on its own. Together, they added up. Many women arrived in the city already vulnerable. Young women left rural homes to work as servants or factory hands, often in their mid-teens, 14, 15, sometimes younger. Families sent them off with hope and necessity mixed together. One less mouth to feed, one more chance at income. Domestic service was usually the first stop. It was considered respectable, which mattered enormously, but it was also fragile. Servants lived where they worked. Lose the job, lose the bed. Dismissal could happen for reasons that had nothing to do with ability, illness, pregnancy, accusations, or simply being replaced by someone cheaper. Pregnancy was especially unforgiving. There was no quiet leave of absence, no second chances. A pregnant servant was often dismissed immediately, regardless of how the pregnancy happened. Consent was rarely questioned. Responsibility almost never. Once dismissed, the problem became immediate and practical. Rent was due. Food was needed. Respectable employers asked questions that could not be answered safely, and a woman's reputation followed her faster than she could move. Factory work offered wages, but barely survival. Long hours, low pay, dangerous conditions. For women who had children, it was often impossible. Childcare did not exist in any organized way. Missing work meant losing wages. Losing wages meant losing housing. Some women turned to informal work: laundry, sewing, selling goods on the street. These were unstable and seasonal. Illness, injury, or bad weather could wipe out income overnight. There was no cushion, no savings, no safety net. At this point, brothel work did not appear as a moral collapse. It appeared as an option that paid. Sometimes the introduction came through someone already inside the trade. A friend, a cousin, a neighbor. Someone who said, quietly, that there was a way to earn more. That it was not as terrible as people claimed. That it was indoors at least. Warmer, safer than the street. Other times, madams actively recruited. They knew where to look. Train stations, employment offices, poor neighborhoods. They offered meals, lodging, clothing, small kindnesses that mattered deeply to someone with nothing. This is where the question of choice becomes uncomfortable. Some women understood what they were agreeing to. Others did not. Some were misled about the nature of the work. Others knew exactly what it involved, but felt they had no real alternative. Victorian language often tried to separate women into victims and willing participants. Reality did not cooperate. Youth played a large role. Many brothel workers were teenagers. This was not shocking at the time, though it should be now. A young age meant higher demand. It also meant less power to negotiate. Younger women were easier to control, easier to impress, easier to frighten. Once inside a brothel, leaving was not simple, but entering often felt gradual. A few nights, a trial period, a promise of protection. The line between temporary survival and permanent situation blurred quickly. It's also important to understand what women were choosing between. Street prostitution was far more dangerous. Exposure to violence, arrest, illness, and starvation was constant. Brothels, while far from safe, offered structure, rules, doors that locked, a roof. For some women, the brothel felt like the lesser of two harms. Victorian society liked to imagine that fallen women were led astray by temptation. Silk dresses, easy money. The truth was much more ordinary. Hunger is persuasive, so is fear. Once a woman crossed into the brothel world, her identity shifted in the eyes of society. Past work no longer mattered. Past respectability no longer counted. One label replaced all others. This is why entry mattered so much. Not because it was a moral boundary, but because it was a social one. Crossing it closed off paths that might otherwise have reopened. Some women attempted to leave early. They returned to factory work or service, hoping no one would ask questions. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't. Rumors traveled quickly. Employers were cautious. A single whisper could end another job. Over time, the brothel became familiar. Not comfortable, but known. Predictable in its own way. The outside world felt riskier by comparison. This is how temporary solutions became long-term realities. Victorian reformers often spoke of rescue, but they misunderstood entry. They imagined women trapped by vice alone. They ignored economics, gender inequality, and lack of protection. Rescue homes demanded repentance and obedience, not independence. For many women, they offered one form of control in exchange for another. It's also worth noting that not all women entered under the same conditions. Some came from extreme poverty, others from modest backgrounds disrupted by scandal or loss. Widows, abandoned wives, migrants without networks. The brothel world absorbed many kinds of women, unified less by character than by circumstance. What connected them was vulnerability. Looking back, it is tempting to search for a single explanation, a cause, a failure. But Victorian brothel workers did not share one story. They shared a system that gave them few acceptable ways to survive alone. Entry into the brothel world was rarely dramatic. It was quiet, practical, often done without ceremony. A conversation, a decision made late at night, a door closed behind them, and once inside, the city did not rush to pull them back out. Understanding how women entered this world matters, because it challenges the idea that prostitution was separate from normal life. It was not. It sat directly beneath it, catching those who fell through gaps created by low wages, strict morals, and unforgiving judgment. In the next chapter, we'll step fully inside the brothel itself and look at how these places were run, not as dens of chaos, but as businesses with rules, hierarchies, and careful control. If Victorian brothels were anything, they were organized. Not romantic, not chaotic, organized. This surprises people sometimes. Popular stories imagine constant drama, shouting, and disorder. In reality, most brothels ran like strict households. Rules mattered, timing mattered, appearances mattered. Chaos was bad for business. At the center of it all stood the madam. The madam was usually an older woman, often a former sex worker herself. She understood the trade, the risks, and the clients. She was not a fairy godmother, but she was not always a villain either. Her role sat somewhere between manager, landlord, protector, and debt collector. She owned or rented the house. She negotiated with suppliers. She paid bribes when needed. She handled the police, the doctors, and sometimes the reformers. The women rarely dealt with these figures directly. That distance was intentional. For the workers, the madam was authority. She set the rules, what hours you worked, how you dressed, who you could refuse, how much you owed. In better houses, she also enforced standards of safety and cleanliness. Violent clients were turned away. Drunks were refused. In theory at least. Not all madams were careful. Some were exploitative, cruel, and quick to punish. Others tried to keep order and stability, knowing that unhappy workers meant unstable income. The house functioned best when everyone followed the routine. There were many kinds of brothels, and class mattered here as much as anywhere else in Victorian life. High-end houses catered to wealthier clients. These places were quieter, better furnished, and more tightly controlled. Women wore expensive dresses. Conversation was expected. Clients stayed longer. Fewer men, more money per visit. Lower-end houses were crowded, louder, and exhausting. More clients, less pay, less protection. Rooms were smaller. Standards were lower. These houses sat closer to taverns and poorer neighborhoods, where police attention was harsher and violence more common. Between these extremes were dozens of variations. The city produced brothels the way it produced everything else, on a sliding scale of comfort and risk. Inside the house, hierarchy mattered. Newer women ranked lowest. They got the least desirable clients and the least flexibility. Older or more experienced workers sometimes had privileges, better rooms, preferred hours, or loyal customers. Favoritism existed, so did jealousy. Living and working in close quarters amplified everything. Small tensions had nowhere to go. Privacy was limited. Silence was rare. The house itself followed a routine. Days were quiet. Late mornings, cleaning, repairs, laundry. Afternoons were for preparation. Hair, makeup, dresses, corsets, tightened and retightened. Small talk rehearsed like lines in a play. Evenings brought waiting. This was one of the strangest parts of brothel life. Long stretches of nothing, women sitting together in parlors, pretending to read, chat, or relax, listening for footsteps, for the sound of a door opening, for the madam's voice calling a name. Waiting could be more exhausting than work. Time moved slowly. Every knock mattered. Rules governed behavior inside the house. No stealing from clients, no fighting with other women, no bringing outsiders in. Drinking was often allowed, sometimes encouraged, but too much could lead to punishment. Some houses fined women for breaking rules. Others deducted money quietly and without explanation. Fines were useful. They kept women in debt. This is where control became subtle. Rent, food, clothing, laundry, medical fees, all charged back to the worker. On paper, she earned money. In reality, much of it returned to the house. Debt made leaving difficult, sometimes impossible. The madam also controlled movement. Some houses allowed women to come and go freely during the day. Others restricted leaving without permission. This was framed as protection, and sometimes it was. The streets were dangerous, but protection and control often used the same language. Brothels also had rules about appearance, hair color, dress length, jewelry. Everything was chosen to attract clients and maintain the house's reputation. Individual preference mattered less than consistency. Women were part of a product. That product had a look. Despite this, many women formed bonds inside the house. Shared meals, shared jokes, shared complaints. Dark humor helped. Laughing at clients was common once the door closed. It was one of the few spaces where honesty was allowed. These relationships could be supportive or fragile. Competition was built into the system. Clients chose. Youth mattered. Favor shifted. Friendship existed alongside rivalry, and neither ever fully disappeared. It's important to say this clearly. Brothels were not families. Some madams liked to use that language. It sounded comforting. It implied care. But families do not charge rent for affection. They do not fine you for being tired. Still, compared to the streets, brothels offered structure, predictability, a door that locked, a bed that was yours, even if it was rented. For many women, the house became the center of life. The outside world faded. New names replaced old ones. New routines replaced past habits. The brothel created a small, closed universe, separate from respectable society but deeply shaped by it. Clients rarely saw this structure. They saw performance, clean rooms, smiles, polite conversation. They did not see the rules posted behind doors, the debts written in ledgers, the exhaustion managed quietly. That separation was part of the business. The madam's job was to maintain the illusion, comfort without chaos, pleasure without consequence, order without questions, and for the women inside, daily life became a careful balance. Follow the rules, manage the debt, protect what little autonomy remained. Try not to think too far ahead. The house was not freedom, but it was shelter of a kind, a controlled space in a city that offered little mercy to women alone. In the next chapter, we'll slow down even further and walk through a full day and night inside the brothel hour by hour where routine, waiting, and performance blended into something that felt almost timeless. A working day in a Victorian brothel did not begin early. This was not a sunrise job. Morning, for the most part, was quiet. The house slept late, like a creature that only truly woke after dark. Women usually rose around late morning or early afternoon. There was no alarm clock, but there was habit. Bodies learned the rhythm. Curtains stayed drawn. Daylight was not useful here. It revealed too much. The first hours were slow. Washing, brushing hair. Small aches noticed now that the night was over. Someone might complain about a sore foot or a tight corset from the night before. Another woman might joke that her corset was plotting against her. Dry humor helped. It was easier to laugh at discomfort than to dwell on it. Food was simple. Bread, tea, whatever the house provided. Meals were not social events. They were practical pauses. Eat enough to get through the night. Not so much that you felt heavy later. By afternoon, the house shifted. Cleaning began. Floors swept. Bedding changed. Mirrors wiped. The madam inspected rooms, pointing out mist dust or rumpled sheets. Cleanliness mattered, not for comfort, but for reputation. A messy house lost clients. Preparation took time. Hair had to be styled, sometimes restyled. Dresses chosen carefully, not for personal tastes, but for what sold best. Bright colors, tight fits, fashion that suggested effort without revealing fatigue. Corsets were tightened slowly, with help. No one did this alone. A second set of hands pulled the laces while someone else held the frame. Breathing adjusted, posture corrected, the body reshaped into what the evening required. Makeup followed, powder, rouge, sometimes heavy, sometimes restrained, depending on the house. Faces became masks, not fake exactly, but deliberate. This was not how women looked when they were alone. This was how they looked when they were working. By early evening, the house was ready. Then came the waiting. Waiting was the longest part of the job and the least discussed. Hours spent sitting in parlors, arranged just so. Chairs angled, dresses smoothed, smiles practiced, and then dropped when no one was looking. Conversation drifted. Small talk, complaints about weather, teasing remarks about clients from the night before. Someone might imitate a customer's voice and cause quiet laughter. Humor softened the edges. It reminded everyone they were still themselves, at least a little. Silence followed laughter. long stretches of it. The sound of the front door opening changed everything. Heads lifted, spines straightened, expressions adjusted in seconds. The madam greeted the client. Voices softened. Politeness returned like a switch flipped on. Women were called by name or gesture. Chosen, passed over, chosen again. Rejection happened often and quietly. It stung, but reacting showed weakness. Better to sip tea and pretend not to notice. Once upstairs, time became strange. Some clients rushed. Others lingered. Some wanted conversation more than anything else. Complaints about wives, about work, about life. The women listened, nodded, offered sympathy on demand. This listening was work, emotional work. It required attention without attachment, warmth without vulnerability, the ability to seem interested while staying distant inside. Between clients, there were brief pauses. Adjust clothing, fix hair, breathe, maybe joke with another woman in the hallway. Sometimes there was barely time for that. In lower-end houses, the pace could be relentless, one after another. Little rest, little privacy. As the night deepened, fatigue set in. Feet ached, corsets pressed harder. Smiles took more effort. Alcohol helped some women stay light, but it dulled others. Houses differed on how much drinking was allowed. To sober felt cold. To drunk brought punishment. The madam watched carefully. Around midnight, the house was busiest. This was when men arrived after taverns closed. Loud, unsteady, impatient. Screening mattered here. Some were turned away. Others slipped through. Safety was never guaranteed, only managed. By early morning, the energy shifted again. Fewer clients, slower pace. Exhaustion visible now. Makeup smudged. Voices quieter. The performance softened. Not because the job was over, but because everyone was running on what little remained. When the last client left, there was no applause, no sense of completion, just relief. Clothes were loosened, corsets unlaced, bodies reclaimed slowly. Some women washed immediately, others collapsed onto beds without energy for ritual. Sleep came fast, or not at all, depending on the night. This routine repeated, night after night, week after week. What made it harder was not just the work, but the repetition, the sameness, the feeling that time blurred together. Days measured not by calendars, but by how tired you felt. And yet, within this routine, women found small acts of control, choosing a dress they liked, refusing a client when allowed, saving a coin quietly, laughing when it felt forbidden. These moments mattered. Victorian society often imagined brothel workers as either constantly suffering or constantly indulging. The truth was more ordinary. Most days were neither dramatic nor glamorous. They were long, they were tiring, they were work. Emotional labor was constant, smiling when you wanted silence, listening when you wanted distance, being agreeable when you wanted rest. The body worked, but the mind worked harder. Some women learned to split themselves, one part present, one part elsewhere, thinking about nothing, or thinking about future plans that might never come. This separation was not madness, it was survival. By morning, the city outside was waking, workers heading to factories, shops opening, church bells ringing. Inside the brothel, the day ended. Curtains were drawn again, beds filled, the house returned to quiet. Another cycle complete. It's easy to imagine this life as constantly intense. In reality, its weight came from endurance, from doing the same thing again while knowing how little changed. And yet, many women survived years inside this routine, not because it was easy, but because they adapted. They learned where to give energy and where to conserve it. They learned which emotions to show and which to hide. The brothel day was not a single event, it was a pattern. And patterns, once learned, can feel almost normal even when they shouldn't. In the next chapter, we'll look at how appearance became more than decoration in this world. How clothing, youth, and the body itself turned into currency, and what it meant when that currency began to lose value. In the Victorian brothel, clothing was not just clothing, it was equipment. Every dress, ribbon, and tightly laced corset had a job to do. This was not about personal style or self-expression. It was about visibility, attraction, survival. What you wore helped decide how much you earned, how often you were chosen, and how long you stayed valuable in the house. The body itself was part of this calculation. Appearance was labor, and it required constant maintenance. Hair had to be styled daily, sometimes painfully so. Curls pinned into place, stray strands fixed again and again. A mirror became both tool and judge. Too plain, and you were overlooked. Too tired, and it showed. Makeup helped, but it had limits. Powder covered shine and blemishes. Rouge added life to cheeks that often felt anything but lively. In better houses, makeup was subtle. In cheaper ones, heavier. Either way, it was meant to suggest health, youth, and energy, whether those things were present or not. Corsets were unavoidable. They shaped the body into what clients expected to see. Small waists, lifted posture, a silhouette that matched the illustrations of the time. Wearing one for hours was uncomfortable at best, painful at worst. Breathing adjusted, eating adjusted. Standing still for long periods became an exercise in patience. Corsets also reminded women of something important. The body was not entirely theirs. Dresses were expensive, and this mattered more than it sounds. Most women did not arrive with a wardrobe. Clothing was often purchased through the house, at inflated prices, then added to the woman's debt. A dress that looked like luxury on the outside often represented weeks or months of obligation on the inside. Tear a hem, stain fabric, outgrow it. Each problem came with a cost. Fashion changed quickly, even then. Keeping up was part of the job. A dress that looked outdated could affect earnings. Looking fresh mattered. Youth mattered even more. This is where the body as capital becomes painfully clear. A young woman earned more. She was chosen more often, treated, sometimes, with more care. Age reduced value steadily, not dramatically at first, quietly. A glance passed over, a client choosing someone else, a comment about looking tired. The decline was rarely sudden. It was gradual and impossible to ignore. Women learned to manage this. Hairstyles adjusted to soften features. Makeup used to hide lines. Humor used to deflect comments. Some leaned into a different uphill conversation. Warmth, familiarity, regular clients helped when they existed. But time always moved forward. Bodies also bore the marks of work. Aches, fatigue, illness, small injuries that did not heal properly because rest was not an option. The body had to keep going, even when it protested. This created constant anxiety. Staying attractive was not vanity, it was financial planning. Losing appeal meant fewer clients. Fewer clients meant less income. Less income meant deeper debt or movement to a lower-class house. And lower-class houses were harder places to work. Appearance rules were enforced differently depending on the madam. Some allowed small personal touches. Others demanded strict uniformity. In certain houses, women were expected to dress similarly to create a brand. Individuality mattered less than consistency. This could feel dehumanizing, but it also simplified things. You wore what you were told. You performed what was expected. Thinking less helped some women endure more. It's easy to assume that dressing this way felt empowering or glamorous. Sometimes it did, briefly. New clothing could feel like a transformation, a reminder that you could still attract attention, still command a room, but that feeling rarely lasted. More often, clothing felt like armor, heavy, restrictive, necessary, something you put on to do a job and removed as soon as possible. Relief came not from admiration, but from unlacing at the end of the night. There was also risk attached to appearance. Standing out too much invited attention. Police noticed. Neighbors complained. Respectable society drew lines quickly. Looking too fashionable in the wrong place could lead to questioning or arrest. So women learned to blend when outside the house. Shawls pulled close, dresses toned down, faces wiped clean. The same body that was displayed inside had to disappear outside. This double existence took effort. Some women took pride in managing it well, knowing when to shine and when to fade, knowing which street allowed color and which demanded dullness. This awareness became second nature. The cruel part of this system was how clearly it linked worth to appearance, not character, not effort, not endurance, just how closely you matched a moving ideal. When illness struck, everything changed. Weight loss, skin problems, weakness, these were not private struggles. They affected income immediately. Some madams allowed rest, others did not. A sick worker still owed rent. Aging was worse, because it could not be cured. By the mid-20s, many women felt the pressure sharply. Clients preferred younger faces. Competition increased. The same dress that once attracted attention now felt like a reminder of time passing. This fear shaped decisions. Some women saved aggressively, hoping to leave early. Others moved between houses, chasing better conditions. A few married clients or formed long-term arrangements. Most adapted and stayed as long as they could. It's important to understand that the body being used as capital was not unique to brothel work. Factory workers wore out their bodies too. So did laundresses, so did miners. The difference was visibility. Here, decline was noticed immediately and judged openly. The city did not hide this process. It watched. And yet, within these limits, women still found ways to assert control, altering a dress slightly, choosing a color they liked, refusing to wear something that made them feel ridiculous. These were small rebellions, but they mattered. Clothing, in this world, was not about pleasure. It was about timing, about staying useful long enough to survive, about stretching value as far as possible in a system that measured worth quickly and without mercy. By the time a woman felt her appearance slipping, she usually knew it before anyone said anything. The mirror told her. So did the silence between being chosen. This knowledge shaped every day, every preparation, every glance. The Victorian brothel did not just sell intimacy. It sold youth, beauty, and illusion. And the women inside paid for those things with their bodies, 1 year at a time. In the next chapter, we'll follow the money itself, how much was earned, how much was kept, and how financial independence often turned out to be more illusion than reality. From the outside, brothel work looked like good money. Victorian newspapers hinted at it. Moral reformers complained about it. Neighbors whispered about women who seemed better dressed than they should have been, compared to factory wages or domestic service. The earnings looked impressive, and sometimes, on paper, they were. But paper was doing a lot of lying. A brothel worker did not simply earn money and keep it. Money passed through many hands before it ever felt real. By the time it reached her, it was often lighter than expected and already spoken for. Most houses worked on a split system. A client paid the house paid the woman a portion. How large that portion was depended on the class of the brothel, the woman's status inside it, and the madam's rules. Higher-end houses paid more per client, but expectations were higher too. Lower-end houses paid less and demanded more volume. Then came the deductions. Rent was first. Even though the woman worked for the house, she still paid to live there. Food followed. Laundry, heating, lighting, medical fees, makeup, hairdressing, clothing, shoes, corsets, accessories. Every necessity came with a cost. Some women joked that they paid rent for the privilege of working. Clothing was one of the biggest expenses. Dresses wore out quickly. Fashion changed. Damage happened. Houses often required women to buy clothing through approved suppliers, which meant inflated prices. The debt quietly grew, written neatly into ledgers the women rarely saw. This is where the illusion of independence took shape. A woman might earn more in a week than she ever had before. She might hold coins in her hand and feel, briefly, powerful. She could buy small luxuries, better food, trinkets, a sense of choice. Compared to scraping by before, it felt like progress. But the structure ensured dependence. Debt was not always forced. Sometimes it was encouraged gently. You'll earn it back soon. This dress will pay for itself. Just one more improvement. Each decision made sense in isolation. Together, they tied women to the house. Leaving meant settling accounts. Many could not. Some madams were fairer than others. A few allowed women to keep more of their earnings. A few helped them save. These cases existed, but they were not the norm. Most houses prioritized stability over freedom. A woman who could not leave was reliable. Saving money required discipline and luck. You had to earn enough, stay healthy, avoid fines, avoid expensive mistakes, hide savings carefully. Theft was common, trust was risky. Even then, savings rarely meant security. There was no bank account in a woman's own name. Money was physical, vulnerable, easy to lose. This financial precarity shaped behavior. Women took clients they disliked because refusing meant less income. They worked when sick because missing a night could mean falling behind. They stayed longer than planned because leaving empty-handed was worse than staying tired. Independence existed in small ways. Choosing when to buy something, sending money to family under a false story, paying off a debt slowly and feeling a little lighter. These moments mattered, but they did not change the structure. Victorian society often imagined brothel workers as financially reckless, spending money on drink, clothes, and entertainment. Some did. Escape has a price, but many spent carefully, knowing how fragile their situation was. What made financial independence so difficult was not just exploitation, it was instability. Earnings fluctuated. A popular woman earned more, then less. Illness cut income instantly. Police raids disrupted business. Changes in neighborhood reputation mattered. One bad month could erase a year of careful saving. And then there was age. As appearance declined, so did income. A woman who once paid off debts easily now struggled to cover basics. The house did not lower rent to match her earning power. Expenses stayed the same. Pressure increased. Some women moved to cheaper houses. Others took more clients. Some accepted arrangements with regular customers for stability. These arrangements could offer financial relief, but they also came with expectations and risk. Marriage was sometimes imagined as an escape. Occasionally, it happened. More often, it did not. Clients enjoyed the relationship as it was. Legal marriage brought responsibility. Many preferred not to complicate things. The cruel irony was that brothel work promised independence from low wages and strict employers, but delivered a different kind of dependence. Instead of a factory owner or household master, there was the madam and the ledger. Even when women left successfully, the money rarely lasted. Without respectable references, finding new work was difficult. Savings disappeared quickly. Some returned to brothel work out of necessity, not failure. This cycle fed the myth that women could not manage money. In reality, they were managing inside a system designed to keep them just stable enough to continue working. There were exceptions. Always exceptions. A small number of women saved enough to open businesses. Some became madams themselves. Others married well or emigrated. These stories existed, and they were often repeated loudly. What was quieter were the thousands who earned, paid, worked, and aged without ever gaining true security. Money in the brothel world was both motivator and trap. It offered relief from immediate hardship while making long-term escape harder. It gave choice in small moments and took it away in larger ones. This contradiction shaped daily life. Women learned to count carefully, to negotiate subtly, to decide which debts mattered most, to accept that some independence was better than none. They were not naive, they understood the trade-offs. Many spoke later of money, not as freedom, but as breathing room, a little space between disaster and survival. Victorian society liked to believe that moral failure explained prostitution. In truth, financial math explained much more. When wages failed, when costs rose, when women were expected to survive without support, money stopped being abstract. It became the difference between shelter and the street. In the next chapter, we'll look at another cost rarely calculated in ledgers: health, disease, fear, and the constant anxiety of a body pushed beyond what medicine of the time could protect. Health was always present in a Victorian brothel, even when no one spoke about it. Especially when no one spoke about it. It hovered in the background of every night, in the careful washing, in the glances at mirrors, in the quiet hope that nothing felt different this morning than it did yesterday. Fear did not arrive loudly. It settled in and stayed. Victorian medicine was limited, confused, and often wrong. Germs were not fully understood. Treatments were experimental at best and harmful at worst. For brothel workers, this mattered deeply because their bodies were not just personal. They were inspected, regulated, and blamed. Sexually transmitted diseases were common, though the language around them was careful and indirect. People spoke of disorders or complaints. Everyone knew what was meant. No one liked saying it out loud. There were no reliable cures. Treatments included mercury, harsh washes, and enforced rest. Mercury, in particular, caused serious damage. Teeth loosened, gums bled, hair fell out, but it was used anyway, because something felt better than nothing. Fear of illness shaped daily behavior. Women checked themselves constantly. A new pain, a rash, fatigue that felt different from normal tiredness. Each sign sparked anxiety. Illness did not just threaten health, it threatened income. Missing work meant losing money. Losing money meant falling behind. Falling behind meant debt. The logic was cruel and simple. Some houses required regular medical examinations. These were not gentle. They were invasive, uncomfortable, and humiliating. Consent was not really part of the process. Compliance was expected. This became law under the Contagious Diseases Acts. These laws allowed police to detain women suspected of prostitution and force them to undergo medical exams. If found ill, they could be confined in hospitals for months. Men were not examined. Men were not detained. The disease, officially, lived only in female bodies. The injustice was obvious to the women affected. It was obvious to many observers too. But policy moved slowly, and suffering moved quickly. Being examined meant being labeled. Once identified, a woman was known to police and doctors. Surveillance followed. Privacy disappeared. Respectable women were protected from scrutiny. Working-class women were exposed to it. Some women tried to avoid detection by moving houses or changing names. Others complied quietly, knowing resistance made things worse. A few fought back, joining protests or speaking out, but most simply endured. Even outside official exams, illness carried stigma. A sick worker could be isolated inside the house or quietly sent away. Madames did not want disease spreading, but they also did not want trouble. Protection depended on how profitable a woman still was. This created a strange tension. The body had to appear healthy, even when it wasn't. Women learned to hide symptoms, to work through pain, to pretend everything was fine long enough to earn what they needed. That kind of pretending takes a toll. Mental health was not a concept Victorians used in the way we do now, but emotional strain was real. Anxiety, dissociation, sleeplessness, drinking to cope. These were common responses to constant pressure and fear. Alcohol served many purposes. It helped clients relax. It helped women soften the edges of work. It dulled fear and fatigue. In moderation, it was almost expected. In excess, it became another problem. Some women drank heavily to get through the night. Others avoided it, knowing it made things worse later. Laudanum, an opium-based medicine, was also common. It was legal, easy to obtain, and dangerously addictive. It quieted pain and anxiety. It also blurred days together. Addiction was not treated as illness. It was treated as weakness, and weakness was punished. Health risks were not limited to disease. Violence caused injuries. Rough clients left bruises, sprains, sometimes worse, falls on stairs, corsets pulled too tight, long hours, standing or sitting in uncomfortable positions. The body absorbed all of it. Rest was rare. True rest even rarer. When a woman became seriously ill, outcomes varied. Some madams allowed time to recover, others did not. If illness lasted too long, the woman was replaced. The house continued. It always did. Hospitals were frightening places. Overcrowded, understaffed, risky. Being sent to one meant loss of income and loss of control. Some women avoided hospitals until they had no choice. By then, it was often too late for effective treatment. Death was not uncommon. It did not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it came quietly, a fever, an infection, complications no one fully understood. The city recorded it in brief lines: name, age, cause, if known. Often, even the name was not real. The fear of illness also shaped relationships between women. Advice was shared quietly. Remedies passed along. Warnings about symptoms. This informal knowledge mattered. It filled gaps left by unreliable medicine. There was care here, even in a harsh system. Women watched out for each other when they could. They reminded each other to wash, to rest when possible, to speak up if something felt wrong. Small acts of protection in a world that offered little. What made health fear so exhausting was its constancy. There was no finish line, no moment of safety. Even a healthy night carried risk. Every client added another calculation. Victorian society often framed disease as moral punishment. Illness was seen as consequence rather than circumstance. This thinking justified harsh treatment. It allowed people to blame women for what happened to them, but disease did not care about morality. It followed conditions: crowding, poor sanitation, lack of treatment, unequal power. Brothel workers lived at the intersection of all of these. Despite this, many survived for years. They adapted. They learned when to push through and when to stop. They learned which fears were constant and which demanded action. This was not ignorance. It was experience. Health, in the brothel world, was never just personal. It was economic, legal, social. A single symptom could ripple outward and change everything. And yet, women kept going. Not because they felt safe, but because stopping felt worse. In the next chapter, we'll look at another kind of danger that shaped daily life. Violence, not only the violence that came from clients, but the uneven protection offered by the very systems meant to maintain order. Violence was never far away in Victorian brothel life. It did not announce itself every night, but it was always possible. Like bad weather, you didn't need to see it to prepare for it. One reason many women chose brothels over street work was safety, or, more accurately, relative safety. A brothel had walls, doors, other people nearby. That mattered. On the street, there was nowhere to retreat, no one to hear you call out. Inside a house, violence was less likely but never impossible. Clients arrived in many moods. Some were polite, nervous, even shy. Others were demanding, drunk, or angry before they ever entered a room. Alcohol played a large role here. Taverns closed late, and brothels stayed open later. Many men arrived already unsteady, their tempers softened or sharpened by drink. Madams tried to manage this. Screening clients was part of the job. Known troublemakers were turned away. Men who seemed too drunk might be refused, at least in theory. In practice, money often complicated judgment. Higher-end houses enforced rules more strictly. Reputation mattered. Wealthier clients expected discretion and calm. Violence was bad for business. Lower-end houses had less control. Turning away a client meant losing income. Sometimes it meant anger. Sometimes it meant threats. Women learned quickly which houses took protection seriously and which did not. Inside the brothel, there were signals and systems. Bells, knocks, codes. A woman in trouble could make noise or shout. Other women or the madam might intervene. This did not always stop violence, but it limited how far it could go. The presence of others mattered psychologically, too. A locked door did not feel as final when help was close by. Still, not all violence was dramatic. Much of it was quiet. Rough handling, ignored refusals, pressure disguised as expectation, a client insisting rather than asking. These moments were harder to report and easier to excuse. Victorian society was not particularly concerned with consent as we understand it today. A client who paid believed he had rights. A woman who worked in a brothel was assumed to have surrendered them. This belief protected men more than it protected anyone else. Outside the brothel, danger changed shape. Police were not reliable protectors. Some officers ignored brothels unless complaints were made. Others used their authority to harass or extort. Protection often depended on bribes, relationships, and neighborhood politics. Justice was uneven and selective. If a woman reported assault, she risked arrest herself. Her occupation worked against her credibility. Courts rarely took her word over a man's. Silence became safer than speaking. This silence shaped everything. Women learned to assess risk quickly. How a man spoke, how he moved, whether he listened. These instincts were survival tools. They were sharpened by experience, not taught by anyone. Madams varied in how much they intervened. Some stepped in immediately when trouble arose. Others blamed the woman for upsetting a client. Protection was conditional. It depended on profit, reputation, and mood. Even when protection existed, it came with limits. A madam could eject a client. She could ban him. She could shout. She could threaten to call the police. But calling the police was risky. It brought attention. Attention brought inspections. Inspections brought trouble. So violence was managed quietly whenever possible. This management extended to how injuries were treated. Bruises covered with makeup. Sprains explained away. Pain endured rather than documented. Visibility invited questions, and questions rarely helped. Some women carried small weapons, hairpins, pins hidden in sleeves, not to attack, but to threaten, to remind a client that compliance went both ways. This was dangerous too. Escalation could make things worse. Others relied on charm, humor, flattery, de-escalation as a skill. Talking a man down became part of the job. This kind of emotional control took energy and practice. It was not guaranteed, but it often worked. Violence also came from competition. Arguments between women happened. Jealousy flared. Stress amplified small conflicts. Physical fights were less common, but not unheard of, especially in crowded houses under pressure. Madams usually punished fighting harshly. It disrupted business. Harmony was enforced, not encouraged. The most unsettling part of violence in the brothel world was how normalized it could become. A bad client was shrugged off. A rough night was just a rough night. Complaints faded quickly. There was no formal process for care or recovery. This normalization did not mean acceptance. It meant adaptation. Women learned what to expect and adjusted expectations downward. Safety was not the absence of danger. It was managing how much danger you could handle and for how long. Victorian society often imagined brothels as places of excess and indulgence. It paid little attention to the constant calculations happening inside. Who was safe? Who was risky? When to refuse? When to endure? Protection, such as it was, depended on informal systems. The madam's reputation, the house's location, relationships with police, the presence of other women. None of these were guaranteed. All could fail. And yet, many women preferred this imperfect protection to the street. That fact alone says something about the alternatives. Street workers faced violence more openly and more often. No walls, no witnesses, no rules. Many women moved to brothels specifically to escape that level of exposure. Even limited protection was better than none. Violence also intersected with class. Wealthier clients expected discretion and politeness. Poorer clients were more likely to be drunk, desperate, or angry. This was not universal, but patterns existed. The kind of house you worked in shaped the risks you faced. Over time, women developed a careful toughness, not hard-hearted, but alert, ready, a sense of when to push and when to retreat. This awareness was exhausting, but necessary. What makes this history difficult is how often violence was treated as background noise, not shocking enough to record, not rare enough to stand out. It blended into daily life. Victorian records rarely captured these moments. Police reports focused on disturbances, not harm. Medical records noted injuries without context. Personal accounts were scarce. Silence filled the gaps. Despite this, women survived, not untouched, but intact enough to continue. That survival required constant negotiation, awareness, and restraint. Violence was part of the environment, like smoke or noise. You learned to live with it, even as it wore you down. In the next chapter, we'll look at how women coped with this pressure through alcohol, drugs, and other forms of escape. Not as moral failure, but as understandable attempts to soften lives that rarely allowed rest. By the time evening arrived in a Victorian brothel, most women were already tired, not just physically, but mentally. The day had been spent preparing, washing, dressing, fixing hair, smoothing faces into something marketable. By night, the performance began, and performances are easier when the edges are softened. This is where alcohol entered the picture. Drink was everywhere in the brothel world. Wine, gin, porter, brandy, sometimes provided by the house, sometimes paid for by clients, sometimes bought with a woman's own money. It served many purposes at once. It relaxed clients, it loosened conversation, and for the women, it dulled the sharpness of the job. A drink before seeing a client was common. Not to get drunk at least, not at first, but to take the edge off nerves, to make smiles come easier, to slow down the constant awareness of one's own body being watched, judged, and used. Alcohol helped blur the line between self and role. Some houses encouraged drinking. A client who ordered bottles stayed longer. A woman who drank with him appeared lively and agreeable. The house profited. The woman paid the price later. Drunkenness, however, was risky. A woman who became too intoxicated lost control of the situation, of her safety, of her earnings. Madams often punished visible drunkenness, not out of concern, but because it disrupted business. Balance was expected: enough drink to perform, not enough to fail. Maintaining that balance night after night was difficult. Over time, tolerance grew. One drink became two became three. What started as a tool became a habit. What became a habit sometimes became a dependency. Gin, cheap and strong, was especially common in lower-end houses. It was affordable and effective. It numbed quickly. It also worsened fatigue, depression, and illness. But in the moment, it worked, and the moment was often all that mattered. Alcohol was not the only escape. Laudanum, an opium-based liquid, was widely available in Victorian Britain. It was legal. It was sold as medicine. It was used for pain, sleep, anxiety, and grief. Many women encountered it through doctors or chemists long before they entered brothels. Inside the trade, laudanum became another way to cope. A few drops could calm nerves. A little more could help with sleep after long nights. For women dealing with pain, fear, or sadness, it offered relief that conversation never did. But laudanum was deceptive. It felt gentle, respectable. Even doctors prescribed it. Middle-class women used it. This made it easier to justify. Dependence crept in quietly. Tolerance increased. Doses grew. What once helped sleep now barely worked. Withdrawal brought restlessness, nausea, and despair. The line between medicine and necessity blurred. Other substances circulated too, though less commonly. Chloral hydrate, morphine, remedies advertised as cures for female troubles. The Victorian medical world was generous with substances and vague about consequences. Addiction was not well understood. It was framed as weakness or moral failure, not a predictable response to stress and pain. For brothel workers, substances served a specific function. They created distance. Distance from the work. Distance from the self. Distance from time. Time moved differently under the influence. Nights passed faster. Thoughts slowed, emotions flattened. This could feel like relief, but escape was temporary. Morning always came. Headaches, tremors, guilt, fatigue, the need to perform again. Substance use often deepened dependency on the brothel itself. A woman in debt, struggling with addiction, had fewer options for leaving. Madams varied in how they handled this. Some tolerated moderate use, others punished it harshly. Addiction reduced reliability. An unreliable worker was a financial risk. In some cases, madams supplied substances directly, charging for them. This created another layer of debt, another tether. Not all women drank or used drugs heavily. Some avoided them deliberately. They stayed sharp. They relied on routine, distance, or emotional detachment instead. But even these strategies had costs. Complete sobriety did not make the work easier. It made it clearer. Clarity could be painful. Alcohol and drugs were not about pleasure, despite appearances. They were about endurance, about making the intolerable tolerable for a few hours at a time. Victorian moralists often pointed to drunkenness as evidence of moral decay. They rarely asked why so many women felt the need to escape in the first place. Cause and effect were conveniently reversed. Substance use also intersected with class. Wealthier houses offered better quality alcohol. Poorer houses relied on cheaper, harsher spirits. The effects showed over time. Health declined faster. Dependence deepened sooner. Doctors sometimes treated brothel workers with contempt. Others treated them as curiosities. Few treated them with consistent care. Substance dependence was rarely addressed directly. It was noted, judged, and left alone. For many women, alcohol also provided social bonding, drinking together after clients left, sharing a bottle in the early hours. These moments created fragile community. Laughter happened here, so did honesty. These were some of the only times women could drop their roles, where names were real, not assumed, where exhaustion was admitted, where fear was shared quietly. Substances lowered defenses, but they also lowered isolation. Still, the long-term effects were hard to escape. Health declined, judgment suffered, financial stability weakened. Addiction made leaving the trade harder, not easier. Some women recognized this and tried to stop. Success depended on environment, support, and luck. A house that punished rather than supported sobriety made it difficult. Rescue homes often demanded immediate abstinence, which led to relapse. Again, choices existed but within narrow boundaries. What matters here is not condemnation, but context. Alcohol and drugs were not indulgences in a carefree life. They were tools in a constrained one, coping mechanisms in an environment that offered few others. The slow deterioration caused by substance use rarely made headlines. It showed up in hospital records, in premature aging, in early deaths attributed vaguely to decline. It also showed up in quieter ways: dullness, forgetfulness, lost years. Victorian society liked simple stories: fallen women, moral weakness, vice punished by nature. The reality was messier. Escape was not a desire for excess. It was a need for relief. Relief from repetition, from danger, from being constantly available. Substances provided a pause, a short one, an imperfect one. But sometimes it was all that stood between endurance and collapse. In the next chapter, we move away from substances and towards something harder to see but just as powerful: social isolation and stigma. The way being cut off from family, from identity, from normal life shaped these women long after the lamps were extinguished. Even when a Victorian brothel was full of people, it could feel deeply lonely. Noise did not equal connection. Company did not mean belonging. For many women, isolation was one of the heaviest parts of the work, even heavier than exhaustion or fear. The separation often began the moment a woman entered the trade. Many cut ties with family intentionally, not out of anger, but protection. Families depended on reputation to survive. A daughter known to be fallen could damage marriage prospects for sisters, employment for relatives, and standing in the neighborhood. Silence became an act of care, however painful. Others were rejected outright. Once discovered, there was no quiet return. Doors closed, letters went unanswered. Home became a place that no longer existed. Inside the brothel, women rarely used their real names. Assumed names were standard. They offered a thin layer of safety, but they also created distance. Identity became flexible, temporary. You were who the house said you were. This made it easier to disappear and harder to be remembered. Friendships inside the house existed, but they were fragile. Women came and went. Competition for clients created tension. Trust was cautious. Sharing too much could be used against you later, intentionally or not. Still, bonds formed. Shared routines, shared exhaustion, shared jokes, whispered late at night. These connections mattered. They were not trivial, but they existed within limits. Outside the brothel, social life was narrow. Many women avoided being seen during daylight, not because they were ashamed, but because recognition brought risk. Landlords could evict. Shopkeepers could refuse service. Neighbors could report suspicious behavior. Visibility was dangerous. Going to church was complicated. Some attended quietly, others avoided it altogether. Religious spaces preached forgiveness, but congregations practiced judgment. Being recognized could lead to public humiliation or intervention. Marriage, in the respectable sense, was largely closed off. Past involvement in prostitution carried a permanent stain. Even if a woman left the trade, her history followed her in whispers and records. This stigma was unevenly applied. Men who visited brothels suffered little consequence. Women bore the full weight of blame. Respectability was fragile for women and nearly indestructible for men. The language used to describe brothel workers reflected this. Fallen, ruined, unclean. These words did not describe behavior. They described status. Once applied, they were difficult to remove. This labeling had psychological effects. Being constantly defined by one role made it hard to imagine another. Over time, some women internalized the judgment. Others resisted it quietly. Many moved back and forth between the two. Social isolation also meant lack of support in crises. Illness was faced alone. Pregnancy was managed discreetly. Grief went unshedded. There were few places to speak openly without consequence. Emotional life became compressed. Children, when they existed, complicated everything. Some women gave birth secretly and placed children with wet nurses or relatives under false names. Others sent money home while remaining invisible. Motherhood had to exist at a distance. The fear of exposure shaped daily decisions. Where to walk, where to shop, who to speak to. Life narrowed to safe routes and known faces. Isolation was not always total. Some women maintained small circles outside the trade. A sympathetic shopkeeper, a neighbor who asked no questions. These relationships were rare and precious, but the broader society remained closed. Victorian reformers often spoke about rescuing women from brothels. Less attention was given to what awaited them outside. Leaving the trade did not restore social acceptance. It often meant entering another form of isolation, this time without income. Work options were limited. Domestic service was closed to women with known histories. Factory work paid little and offered no protection. Many women returned to brothels not because they wanted to, but because it was the only place where their past did not immediately disqualify them. Inside the brothel, their status was known and accepted. Outside, it was a mark that followed them. This created a strange inversion. The place condemned by society offered community, however imperfect. The society that condemned it offered little room for return. Stigma also erased complexity. Women were seen as symbols rather than people, moral lessons rather than individuals. This made their inner lives invisible. They were rarely asked how they felt, rarely listened to without judgment, rarely remembered as anything other than cautionary tales. This erasure continues in historical records. Names are missing, voices are absent, lives appear only in fragments arrest records, hospital admissions, census lines marked vaguely. Social isolation made these gaps wider. Yet, within these constraints, women found ways to maintain identity. Personal items, letters never sent, small rituals, humor shared in private. These were acts of resistance, however quiet. Isolation did not mean emptiness. It meant containment. Life compressed into smaller spaces. The cost of this compression was heavy. Loneliness deepened. Self-worth eroded. Hope became cautious. Still, survival continued, day after day, night after night. In the next chapter, we will examine the people who claimed to offer solutions. Reformers, rescuers, and moral crusaders. Their intentions varied. Their impact was complex. And their version of help often came with conditions that reshaped women's lives in new and difficult ways. By the middle of the Victorian era, brothels were no longer just whispered about. They were debated, studied, sermonized over. Entire careers were built around the problem of prostitution, and into this world stepped the reformers. They came with pamphlets, prayers, statistics, and very firm opinions. Many genuinely believed they were helping. That part matters. The Victorian reform movement was not made up only of villains. It included people who were disturbed by poverty, by disease, by the suffering they saw in the streets and houses. But good intentions did not always lead to gentle outcomes. Reformers rarely asked women what they wanted. They assumed they already knew. The dominant belief was that prostitution was a moral failing, not an economic one. Women were seen as led astray by temptation, weakness, or bad character. Rescue therefore meant correction. Salvation required submission. This mindset shaped every solution. Rescue homes were one of the most common responses. On paper, they offered shelter, food, and a way out of the trade. In reality, they came with strict rules: silence, prayer, long hours of unpaid labor, usually laundry or sewing, absolute obedience. Women were expected to repent before they could rebuild. Daily life in these homes was tightly controlled. Letters were monitored, visits were restricted. Leaving without permission could result in being turned out with nothing. The structure resembled a convent or a prison, depending on who you asked. For some women, these homes provided real relief. Regular meals, safety from violence, a break from constant performance. For others, the loss of autonomy was unbearable. Trading one form of control for another did not feel like rescue. Religious reformers were often sincere, but rigid. They believed suffering had moral meaning. Endurance was a virtue. Complaints were signs of resistance to salvation. Women who struggled to adapt were labeled ungrateful or incorrigible. Magdalene asylums took this further. Originally intended as temporary refuges, many became long-term institutions. Some women stayed for years. A few never left. The line between help and punishment blurred. Reformers also pushed for legal solutions. Laws aimed at regulating or eliminating prostitution were passed with confidence and enforced unevenly. The most infamous were the Contagious Diseases Acts. These laws allowed police to detain women suspected of prostitution and force them to undergo medical examinations. The stated goal was public health. The actual result was humiliation and fear. Men were not examined. Men were not detained. Responsibility fell entirely on women. Reformers defended this imbalance by arguing that women were the visible carriers of disease. This ignored basic logic and reinforced existing power structures. It also deepened mistrust between brothel workers and authorities. Some women avoided hospitals and clinics entirely, fearing arrest. Health suffered as a result. Not all reformers agreed on methods. There were internal conflicts. Some advocated education and employment opportunities. Others demanded stricter policing. Debates filled newspapers and lecture halls. The women at the center of these debates were rarely present. A few former brothel workers did speak publicly. Their voices were powerful and unsettling. They talked about hunger, wages, and lack of options. These testimonies complicated the moral narrative. They were often dismissed as exceptions. Charity organizations sometimes offered job placement. Domestic service was the preferred solution, but employers demanded references and spotless reputations. Many women were rejected immediately. Those who succeeded often earned less than they had before. Long hours, little pay, no security. Some returned to brothels quietly, ashamed but practical. Reformers tended to interpret this return as failure of character, not failure of the system. One of the greatest limitations of reform movements was their refusal to address male demand. Brothels existed because customers existed, yet reform focused almost exclusively on women. Closing a brothel did not close the need that created it. It displaced it. Some reformers knew this and argued for broader social change, better wages, education, housing. These voices existed, but they were often drowned out by louder moral crusades. Moral clarity was easier than structural reform. For brothel workers, reformers were unpredictable. A kind visitor one day, a police raid the next. Help and punishment came from similar-looking people with similar language. This unpredictability reinforced caution. Trust was risky. Accepting help meant giving up control. Rejecting it meant continued stigma. There was no neutral choice. Some women used reform institutions strategically, entering briefly to rest or recover, leaving when pressure became too much. This was risky and not always possible, but it happened. Others avoided reformers entirely. They had learned that visibility invited intervention, and intervention rarely respected their wishes. The most painful aspect of reform was how often it erased complexity. Women were sorted into categories: saved or fallen, repentant or stubborn. There was little room for ambiguity, but real lives were ambiguous. A woman could hate her work and still rely on it. She could want out and fear what awaited outside. She could appreciate kindness and resist control at the same time. Reform narratives struggled to hold these contradictions. In some cases, reform did lead to lasting change. A small number of women built new lives with support, patience, and luck. These stories were celebrated widely. The many who did not succeed were quietly forgotten. Victorian society liked clear endings, redemption or ruin. It was uncomfortable with ongoing struggle. For brothel workers, reform was another force to navigate, another set of expectations, another system claiming authority over their lives. Help was available, but rarely on their terms. As we move into the next chapter, we will look at what happened when youth faded and reformers lost interest. When bodies aged, options narrowed, and the future grew uncertain. Because in the Victorian brothel world, survival was not just about getting through tonight, it was about what came after. Youth was currency in the Victorian brothel world. It was not subtle, and it was not kind. A woman's value was tied closely to how young she appeared, not how long she had survived. Most women entered the trade in their teens or early 20s. At first, time seemed distant. Nights blurred together. Weeks passed quickly, but aging did not wait. By the mid-20s, change became noticeable. Skin showed fatigue. Recovery took longer. Clients commented, sometimes casually, sometimes cruelly. A familiar sentence began to appear. "She's not what she used to be." This was not sentiment. It was economics. Higher-end houses prized novelty. New faces attracted attention. Regular clients wanted variety. A woman who had been popular for years could be replaced quickly by someone younger. When earnings declined, so did protection. A woman who brought in less money had less leverage. Her room might be downgraded, her share reduced, her tolerance for poor treatment expected to increase. Some women moved to lower-class houses. These places were cheaper, rougher, and more crowded. Clients were fewer, tempers shorter, alcohol heavier. Safety declined alongside income. Others turned to street work as a last resort. This was the most dangerous option. Aging made it worse. Younger women were approached first. Older women waited longer, accepted less, and took greater risks. Few safety nets existed. Savings were rare. Debt was common. Addiction complicated plans. Leaving the trade without resources often meant poverty. The workhouse loomed as a constant threat. For the Victorian poor, the workhouse was not help, it was punishment. Families were separated. Labor was harsh. Conditions were deliberately unpleasant to discourage reliance. Many women feared the workhouse more than the brothel. Illness increased with age. Years of late nights, poor nutrition, substance use, and untreated disease took their toll. Chronic pain was common. Fatigue deepened, but rest was not an option. Pregnancy became more dangerous. Abortions, legal or not, carried risk. Childbirth without support could be fatal. Medical care was uneven and often judgmental. Some women tried to reinvent themselves within the trade, becoming madams, running smaller houses, taking in lodgers. This required capital, connections, and luck. A few succeeded. Becoming a madam offered stability, but came at a cost. Managing other women meant enforcing rules that once felt cruel. Protection required control. Empathy had to coexist with profit. Not everyone wanted this role. Not everyone was allowed it. Others found work related to the trade: cleaning, cooking, sewing, acting as messengers or lookouts. These jobs paid less but carried less physical risk. Marriage remained a distant possibility. Some women married former clients or men who accepted their past quietly. These cases existed, but they were exceptions. Social acceptance remained fragile. Many lived under assumed identities for the rest of their lives. Past records followed them. Police knew names. Hospitals kept notes. Erasure was difficult. Aging also brought reflection. Nights grew quieter. Waiting rooms felt longer. Laughter became rarer. Younger women arrived with the same nervous energy that once belonged to you. This was not always bitter. Sometimes it was weary acceptance. Sometimes it was grief. Victorian society offered little dignity to aging poor women, regardless of occupation. For brothel workers, the stigma compounded this neglect. Reformers focused on youth. Rescue was easier to imagine when someone looked redeemable by Victorian standards. Older women were less visible, less urgent, less marketable as moral victories. They faded from campaigns and sermons. Some women formed informal support networks, sharing rooms, pooling money, caring for one another during illness. These arrangements were fragile but meaningful. Others faced decline alone. The fear of the future was constant. What happens when no one knocks? When no one waits in the parlor? When the body no longer earns? These questions rarely had answers. Aging out of the trade was not a single moment. It was a slow narrowing. Fewer options, shorter nights, longer days, more waiting. It challenged the idea that prostitution was a temporary phase. For many, it shaped an entire lifetime. Survival shifted meaning. It was no longer about getting through tonight. It was about getting through the year, the winter, the illness. The Victorian world did not reward endurance. It rarely noticed it. As we move into the next chapter, we confront the final silence, death, disappearance, and the thin paper trail that remains. Because for most Victorian brothel workers, history did not preserve their voices only, the echoes left behind. For most Victorian brothel workers, there was no clear ending, no final chapter written with intention. Life did not conclude with resolution. It simply stopped being recorded. Death came in many forms, rarely dramatic, often quiet. Disease was the most common: tuberculosis, untreated infections, complications from syphilis, illnesses worsened by exhaustion, poor nutrition, and delayed care. Many women entered hospitals late, when treatment options were limited and judgment was abundant. Hospital records noted symptoms, not stories. Violence also ended lives, though less often than rumor suggested. Assaults gone too far, clients who panicked, arguments that escalated. These deaths sometimes appeared in newspapers briefly, framed as moral lessons rather than human losses. Suicide occurred too, though it was rarely acknowledged openly. Coroners' reports used careful language: melancholia, temporary insanity. The pressures that led there were not examined. Poverty finished many others: exposure, starvation, weakness during harsh winters. The workhouse, meant to prevent destitution, often accelerated decline. What unites these deaths is not how they happened, but how they were remembered or not. Most women were buried in unmarked graves, pauper plots, common ground. No names carved into stone, no visitors returning years later. Families often did not claim bodies, either because they did not know or could not afford to. Funerals, if they happened at all, were brief. Sometimes other women from the house attended. Sometimes the madam paid. Sometimes no one came. The absence of ceremony mirrored the absence of acknowledgement in life. Victorian society liked records. It loved classification, but it recorded brothel workers selectively and impersonally. Census forms listed occupations vaguely or not at all. Police records focused on offenses. Hospital logs reduced people to beds and diagnoses. Names changed frequently. Ages were guessed. Details blurred. This makes tracing individual lives difficult. Historians encounter fragments: an arrest here, a hospital admission there, a death certificate with few details. These pieces rarely align neatly. Silence fills the gaps. Personal diaries are almost non-existent. Literacy was uneven. Privacy was risky. Writing things down created evidence. Many women avoided leaving paper trails intentionally. Letters were burned. Names were altered. Lives were lived lightly on the page. This absence has consequences. Without voices, stereotypes filled the space. Victorian writers described brothel workers as symbols of decay, temptation, or warning, rarely as people navigating constrained choices. These portrayals lingered long after death. Even reformers, who claimed compassion, focused on beginnings and rescues, not endings. What happened after intervention failed was less useful to the narrative. Decline did not inspire donors, so women disappeared quietly from the story. Occasionally, something breaks through the silence. A coroner's inquest transcript that includes a sentence spoken by the woman herself. A medical note describing demeanor rather than disease. A court record that mentions humor, anger, or fear. These moments are brief but powerful. They remind us that behind every entry was a person with preferences, habits, and thoughts. Most of the time, however, the record remains flat. Death certificates often listed occupation bluntly: prostitute, sometimes euphemistically, unfortunate, sometimes not at all. Cause of death was noted. Age was approximate. Family lines were empty. No one asked what she hoped for. No one recorded what she endured. The lack of records does not mean lives were insignificant. It means they were considered unworthy of preservation. History chose what to keep. This erasure was not accidental. It reflected broader Victorian attitudes about class and morality. Poor women, especially those deemed immoral, were not expected to leave legacies. Memory was reserved for the respectable. This makes modern understanding difficult. We want closure. We want to know how lives ended. Often, we cannot. What we can know is the pattern. Early death was common. Life expectancy was short. Survival into middle age was an achievement, not a given. And yet, even within this bleak reality, traces of care appear. A fellow worker listed as informant on a death certificate. A small sum left behind to pay for burial. A note in a hospital log describing kindness shown to others. These details suggest relationships that existed outside official acknowledgement. The silence after death did not always reflect a silent life. Victorian cities moved on quickly. New tenants filled rooms. New women replaced old ones. Gas lamps were lit again each evening. The rhythm of the city did not pause. The brothel door closed one last time for a woman, and then opened again for someone else. This continuity is unsettling, but important. It shows how individual lives were absorbed into larger systems. The trade did not depend on one person. It consumed many. When historians look back, they face a choice: to repeat the silence, or to interpret it. Interpreting silence requires care. It means resisting easy conclusions, avoiding the urge to dramatize or sanitize, accepting uncertainty. It also means acknowledging that not every story ends with redemption or tragedy clearly defined. Many end with ambiguity. The lack of records does not erase suffering. It complicates remembrance. For modern viewers, this chapter can feel uncomfortable. We want names, faces, endings, but the absence itself is the message. Victorian brothel workers were visible when they served a purpose: to entertain, to warn, to be regulated. When they no longer did, they faded. Their deaths did not disrupt the city. Their absence was absorbed quietly. What remains are ledgers, laws, and moral arguments. The women themselves remain largely unrecorded, and yet, by examining the conditions of their lives, the labor, the risks, the endurance, we restore some measure of presence. Not by inventing details, but by acknowledging what the silence conceals. In the next chapter, we step back from records and deaths and ask a broader question: what did survival really mean in this world? Not survival as victory, but survival as persistence, as endurance without applause. When we talk about survival, we often imagine something dramatic: a narrow escape, a clear victory, a moment where everything turns around. But for Victorian brothel workers, survival was quieter than that, slower, less visible. Survival did not mean thriving. It meant continuing. It meant waking up after a long night and doing what needed to be done again. Washing, dressing, stepping back into a role that did not pause for reflection. There were no milestones to mark progress, no applause for endurance. Most women did not ask, "Is this life good?" The more practical question was, "Can I get through today?" Survival was physical, yes, avoiding disease, avoiding serious injury, eating enough, staying warm. But it was also emotional, holding on to a sense of self in a world that reduced you to function. That part was harder to measure. Many women survived by compartmentalizing. Work was work. Feelings were set aside. Names were flexible. Emotions were managed like any other resource, used sparingly. This was not numbness. It was control. Others survived through small routines. A favorite cup, a certain way of arranging hair, a song hummed quietly while dressing. These details anchored days that otherwise blurred together. Survival also meant knowing when not to hope too much. Hope could be dangerous. Hope for rescue, hope for love, hope for sudden change. When hope failed, disappointment hit harder than reality. Many women learned to keep expectations low, not because they lacked imagination, but because imagination hurt. That does not mean dreams disappeared. They were simply folded away. Some women hoped for something modest: a quieter house, fewer nights, enough savings to stop before sickness forced the issue. These were realistic hopes, shaped by experience. Others hoped for anonymity, to pass unnoticed, to avoid scandal, to leave no trail behind. Survival was also relational. Despite competition and tension, women often relied on one another, lending small amounts of money, covering shifts, sitting quietly with someone who was ill. These acts were rarely recorded, but they mattered. They did not erase hardship, they softened it. Madams sometimes provided stability, not out of kindness alone, but mutual interest. A stable house required functioning workers. Protection, when it existed, was part of survival too. This does not make the system humane. It makes it functional. Victorian society liked to frame brothel workers as reckless or immoral. Survival tells a different story. Recklessness does not endure for years. Careless people do not navigate danger night after night. Survival required attention, calculation, and restraint. Women learned to read rooms quickly, to assess moods, to sense when something was off. These skills were not taught formally, but they were learned deeply. Survival also meant making compromises that outsiders judged harshly. Staying when leaving seemed morally preferable. Drinking when sobriety felt impossible. Accepting conditions that were unfair because the alternative was worse. These choices were not evidence of failure. They were evidence of constraint. Modern perspectives often look for agency in extremes: total freedom or total coercion. Victorian brothel life existed in between. Women made choices, but within narrow margins. Survival lived in that margin. It is important not to romanticize this endurance. Survival was not noble in itself. It was costly. It aged bodies early. It wore down spirits. It narrowed futures. Many women did not survive long. Many survived, but carried invisible damage. Survival was not proof of resilience as virtue. It was a response to necessity. At the same time, it deserves recognition. These women navigated a society that offered them few protections and many judgments. They lived under laws that punished them more than their clients. They faced reformers who spoke over them, and institutions that recorded them only when convenient. Yet they persisted. They adapted. They learned. They found moments of relief where they could. They made lives within constraints, even when those lives were temporary and fragile. Survival also meant invisibility. The ability to move through the city without attracting attention, to blend in during daylight, to avoid notice when trouble came. Being seen was often dangerous. Being unnoticed was a skill. This invisibility extended beyond life. After death, silence followed. Few markers, few records, few memories preserved. And yet, survival was not meaningless simply because it left little trace. History often privileges those who left writings, monuments, or descendants who could speak for them. Victorian brothel workers rarely had these advantages. Their absence from the record reflects social priorities, not personal significance. Survival, in this context, meant existing fully even when unacknowledged. It meant laughing occasionally, caring sometimes, feeling fear often, feeling boredom, feeling irritation, feeling moments of peace that did not make sense from the outside. These ordinary emotions matter. They remind us that survival was not constant suffering. It was uneven. Some nights were tolerable. Some days were calm. Some moments felt almost normal. Those moments helped sustain the rest. Survival also meant endurance without narrative closure. There was rarely a moment where life turned around. For most women, survival was ongoing until it wasn't. No final transformation. No lesson neatly learned. This challenges how stories are usually told. We like arcs, beginnings and endings. Victorian brothel workers lived mostly in the middle, in repetition, in cycles. Recognizing this does not strip meaning from their lives. It adds honesty. To survive in that world was not to win. It was to persist in conditions that did not care whether you did or not. And persistence, even quiet persistence, has weight. As viewers, the temptation is to judge, to ask what we would have done differently. But that question assumes options that often did not exist. A better question is simpler. What did it take to get through another day? The answer is rarely heroic. It is practical. It is human. Survival meant adjusting expectations, redefining success, finding tolerable ways to live within intolerable systems. It meant continuing, not conquering. As this chapter closes, there is no grand conclusion to offer. No moral resolution that ties everything neatly together. That, too, reflects reality. Survival did not come with meaning attached. Meaning is something we assign later, when we have the distance and safety to do so. What we can say is this: survival was real. It was difficult, and it was achieved, day after day, by women whose lives were constrained, judged, and largely forgotten. Not heroes, not symbols, just people doing what they could with what they had. And that, in its own quiet way, is worth remembering. The city is quiet now, though the gas lamps still flicker in the early morning fog. London exhales under a pale sky, and the streets seem to hold their breath. The brothel doors have closed, shutters pulled, curtains drawn. Inside, the women are gone, sleeping, dressing, walking into the uncertain day. Outside, the city moves on as if nothing has happened. And in a sense, that is exactly how it was meant to be. You may never know her name. She may have left no letters, no diaries, no photographs. Perhaps she was only ever a note in a police ledger, a brief mention in a hospital record, a line in a census form. But she existed. She laughed. She worried. She endured. She lived her life within walls that protected as much as they confined. And she survived, in ways that were quiet, complex, and often invisible. We have spent these chapters exploring her world, her work, her dangers, her strategies, her limits, her small triumphs and losses. Yet even as we leave the pages of history behind, her presence lingers, faint but undeniable. In the streets, in the fog, in the echo of everyday survival. The Victorian brothel worker was not a cautionary tale. She was not a villain, nor a saint. She was human. She navigated the constraints of her society with practical intelligence, emotional endurance, and, sometimes, remarkable resilience. Survival, in her world, was not about glory or recognition. It was about persistence. It was about negotiating danger, managing relationships, enduring labor, and finding moments of relief, however fleeting. It was about being alive when society preferred that she be invisible. And yet, in this invisibility lies a strange form of intimacy. By considering her life, by acknowledging the spaces she occupied, the choices she made, the challenges she faced, we glimpse a reality that has been largely silenced. We see the human being behind the records, the ledger entries, and the moral judgments. We see the small acts of courage, humor, and care that history rarely celebrates. Perhaps that is what it means to remember her. Not to reconstruct a perfect narrative, not to impose modern ideas of right or wrong, but to witness her life with empathy, to honor the persistence it took simply to endure, and to recognize that her world, though distant in time, reflects aspects of human experience that are timeless: the struggle for agency, the need for connection, and the quiet labor of survival under impossible circumstances. As dawn spreads over London, the fog begins to lift. Gas lamps flicker one last time before yielding to the growing light. The city hums, indifferent but alive. Somewhere within it, the echoes of women who worked behind closed doors persist, faint, quiet, enduring. And as you close this story, you are left with a choice: to judge, to sensationalize, or to remember. Remember the woman you never knew, the lives that history often forgets, and the resilience that can exist in silence. Her story has no dramatic ending, no grand triumph. It is not meant to. It is meant to be witnessed, quietly, like the flickering of a lamp in the fog, and carried with you not as entertainment, but as a reminder of lives lived under conditions both harsh and human. She survives, in memory, if nowhere else. As we step back out onto those gaslit Victorian streets, one thing becomes clear. The lives of brothel workers were far more complex than the stereotypes history left behind. They were shaped by harsh laws, limited choices, and constant risk, but also by resilience, community, and survival in a society that rarely offered mercy. If this story changed the way you see Victorian life, take a moment to like the video. Really helps the channel reach more people who love thoughtful history. I'd also love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below and let me know what surprised you most. For more calm, immersive stories that explore the hidden sides of history, subscribe to the channel and check out the other videos you see on screen now. Each one uncovers another world history often chose to forget. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep listening to the quiet stories of the past.